So, this is the plan for the talk. I'm going to be briefly telling you a bit about the sort of clinical aspects of conduct disorder, of psychopathy, just so you get a flavour of the population we're talking about. And then really talk about a very, very brief history of the literature on moral reasoning from a highly personalised account. In fact, it is my history of interactions with moral reasoning positions, just to explain some of the origins of the positions that I'm going to be pushing this afternoon. I'm then going to be talking about this prerequisite for the development of morality and fact psychopathy and callous and unemotional traits, and talk about its neurobiology, so the neural systems involved. And then I'm going to be talking about several other implications of work with psychopathy for understanding of the development of morality. Now, I want to be very clear, I am not going to cruelly attack Mark, despite the enthusiasm I might have felt this morning for that purpose. But one, I thought the cruel attack was done so very nicely by Josh, so it really doesn't need a second one. And also, I'm now older than I used to be when I was doing those sorts of cruel attacks, and I'm more mellow, so I don't do that sort of thing anymore. So anything I might make any digs at Mark will not be cruel, they'll just be minor, just little caresses as we go through. So, there we go. First off, it's purely the participants, purely just telling you about this stuff from a clinical point of view. So what we're really looking at from a clinical point of view. Because psychopaths have been mentioned quite a few times, but I just want to make a couple of clinical points. I mean, just to get you a flavour of what these people are really are all about. And we're really talking about, so you have to be very careful with the psychopathy literature, because there's DSM criteria, the psychiatric terminology, for something called conduct disorder, and then another thing in childhood is called conduct disorder, and then in adulthood it's called antisocial personality disorder. And basically these psychiatric definitions are purely driven by whether the person has done antisocial behaviour. And so these are some of the variables: destructiveness, deceitfulness, theft, truancy, that make that, if you do enough of them, make you meet criteria for conduct disorder. And there's an equivalent set of behaviours that you see in an adult that make you meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. The real problem about this is that there's massive heterogeneity if we look at individuals with antisocial personality disorder or conduct disorder. This is just data with conduct disorder, and what you see is this huge heterogeneity, including this considerable comorbidity with mood and anxiety disorders. And the reason why I'm saying this to you is because, in fact, psychopathy, or high levels of callous unemotional traits, protect you from the development of mood and anxiety disorders. You don't find mood and anxiety disorders in individuals with elevated levels of callous unemotional traits. And so the reason I'm sort of saying this is because we can show from these data that if we just look at conduct disorder, or we just look at antisocial individuals more generally, we've got a serious problem, because some of those individuals have one type of pathophysiology that puts them at risk for high levels of conduct problems, so the CU traits, but protects them from developing these mood and anxiety disorders. And then we've got another type of pathophysiology that actually puts you at risk of showing increased levels of aggression, but also for these mood and anxiety disorders. In other words, the antisocial population, even the population that meets these sort of psychiatric definitions, is not a homogeneous population. There are at least two separable populations in there. And this really, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but there's now a bunch of studies looking at what's been termed negative emotionality, impulsive aggressivity, a few other sorts of phrases. And what you're seeing in that population is going to be the exact opposite of what I'm going to be, or to a certain extent, the exact opposite of what I'm going to be talking about with callous and unemotional traits. There's a very nice paper came out a couple of days ago in Nature, which particularly exemplified this sort of problem. It was again finding a relationship between what they termed as impulsive aggressivity on using one of the actual psychopathy scales, but just a subscale of that, this impulsive aggressivity, and finding the opposite of what's typically found in classic individuals with psychopathy. I mean, this was a healthy population just using a personality variable and looking at a personality correlate with the brain. But again, it was a very nice, clear demonstration And it was a clear demonstration of the relationship between this impulsive aggressivity. And again, we see it in a wide variety of other sets of data as well, that we see a population out there who have increased amygdala responses, increased nucleus accumbens responses, increased OFC responses to these sorts of emotionally provocative situations, the exact opposite of what I'm going to be telling you about with respect to callous unemotional traits. But indeed, the exact what you would expect if you had a population out there who were at increased risk for mood and anxiety disorders. So in other words, it's one of these things that we have to be, a bit like with Walter was saying, that we have to be very clear when we're defining morality, what sort of computational processes we're going at in any individual study. We have to be very clear as well to define very carefully what population that we're after. And so that's just a caveat at the beginning. So, talking about callous unemotional traits, what we're talking about here is these things on the left-hand side over here. So this issue's about not showing emotion, but particularly does not feel bad or guilty for what they've done, and doesn't show significant levels of, there's no actual reference in the kiddie version, this is an antisocial process screen device for children, but there's no actual explicit reference to empathy. But in the adult equivalent, there's explicit references to a reduced level of empathy. So consistent part of the defining criteria of psychopathy is these profound emotional problems with respect to guilt, with respect to empathy, and also with respect to attachment to significant others. And what you actually see quite nicely is that IQ, socioeconomic status, and age, all of those have predictive power for how much antisocial behavior you show. So the older you are after the age of 20, the less antisocial behavior you show. The higher your IQ, generally the less antisocial behavior you show. The higher your socioeconomic status, again, predicts how much antisocial behavior you'll show. But none of these variables have any predictive power for these emotional components of psychopathy. Those variables don't allow us to predict anything about how much somebody will show these callous unemotional traits. And so what I'm really going to be arguing when I'm talking about psychopathy is the sort of biological basis to these callous unemotional traits that put you at risk for increased levels of unfortunate behavior. This is just, again, very briefly to say about the samples. I'm going to be showing at least 3 studies, possibly 4 studies if I have time, of patient studies with conduct disorder and callous unemotional traits versus healthy comparison used. They're all used in these sample. Average IQ over 100 because it's a non-clinic based, non-forensic based population. Age, the average age is just over 13, mostly male, but I mean we're talking about 2/3 rather than all male. Scores massively differing on that antisocial process screening device, differing on the YPI, a self-assessment version of psychopathy, and then these inventory of callous unemotional traits, focusing just on the callous unemotional traits. Again, massive differences. PCLYB, again, massive differences, but we don't do that with the healthy controls. And then also in these 2 aspects of aggression, the goal-directed, instrumental aggression, they're much more likely to use aggression to meet their goals, but they also show significantly increased levels of reactive aggression, having temper tantrums on the basis of frustration and lashing out according to that. So let's just give you a flavor of the population that I'm going to be talking about, the characteristics of the population I'm talking about. And now very briefly going to just say a little bit about where I came at with this respect to this literature on the basis of my undergraduate history and then on from that. It's completely personalized, rabidly egocentric. But the only reason why I want to say this is because some of the issues then said are sort of being echoed again now. And so I just wanted to come up. So, in some respects, there was a very dominant position, at least when I was an undergraduate, Kohlberg's position, on a sort of staged progression, a unitary model of morality. You constructed in a sort of theoretical progression way a unitary moral system that allowed you to process all these very complicated moral scenarios that Kohlberg tested individuals on. So it was a unitary moral position, very much based on the idea of rational thought, and theory construction being the sort of dominant theoretical models about how you got morality going, with a little bit of perspective taking being important thrown in, although not so much with Kohlberg. And one of the things that was concluded from this sort of literature was, in fact, that moral reasoning, decision-making, was irrelevant for behavior. And the reason why that was the case was because the type of Kohlberg-type tasks, nobody could very reliably find consistent differences between antisocial populations and healthy populations in their moral reasoning level. So the argument was made that really, moral reasoning was completely separate from moral behavior. And that's sort of echoed in some of Mark's work now, where, you can have this reasoning system completely independent, or at least partially independent, from the actual behavior stuff, or the behavior comes after the, So, and certainly when I was, coming at this, beginning to, this just didn't seem to be right. It didn't seem to be right that we were having this major sort of theoretical process. I mean, I couldn't remember ever having any sort of theoretical process that would, through my sort of sense of morality. Perhaps I never had a sense of morality, but I like to believe I had a sense of morality, so I was worried about that. And also, this didn't seem to be something I liked either. And then I was introduced to this moral conventional distinction, which now had several mentions already today. And this moral conventional distinction was, as far as I was concerned, the kiss of death for a unitary moral position. I mean, I very much am sympathetic with Walter's arguments, with the idea that there's no such thing as a unitary moral system. And then, in fact, we do have to be extremely careful at dividing it up according to what we really want to go chasing after. Certainly as cognitive neuroscientists, but I think more generally, it's critical to start making these divisions. And really, although they weren't phrasing it in the way that Walter would phrase it, the fact is, as far as I'm concerned, that's what the domain theorists, Turiel, Smetana, and Nucci, were doing all that time about, because they made this really nice distinction between what I would now refer to as care-based morality or harm-based morality, and then this social disorder-based convention. I'm not really going to repeat the moral conventional distinction because it indeed has come up so many times before already today. But it really was massively problematic, particularly since Kohlberg was arguing that morality came out of convention at some extra stage down the process. And again, since we were seeing the moral conventional distinction being made from the age of 3.5, that was massively problematic for a Kohlbergian type position. And now, and I'm not really going to have any time to talk about it, but now we really can, just indeed sort of echoing what Walter was showing in the last talk, we really can see different neural systems involved in processing care-based moral transgressions from those that involved in processing social disorder-based transgressions. Very nice demarcation can be made. And indeed, so the classic moral convention thing, the thing that I was really been interested in is when you take away the rule, what happens? Healthy individuals very nicely allow conventional transgressions. They're much less likely to allow moral transgressions, just like you heard several times today. Now, so when I was doing this stuff, we had this strong view on, there was, if you were going to go for an empathy type viewpoint, which is where I was, rapidly being pushed by how I was reading the literature, the empathy position at that stage was highly dominated by theory of mind perspective, and it was perspective taking rather than theory of mind, but it was basically a theory of mind perspective. The idea was that if you saw somebody in distress, what you first had to do was represent the internal state of that individual, and then that would generate an emotional response. And I remember being at the movies, and there's a wonderful movie. It's a Dutch version of the movie called The Vanishing. Don't go and see the American version, even though it's done by the same director. Lousy movie, that one. But the Dutch one's really great movie. And right early on in that movie, the villain puts a chloroform mask over this female victim. And you just have a sort of look at her all you see is her eyes. I remember having this amazingly powerful emotional response, knowing that what he was doing was terribly wrong, terribly bad thing to do, on the basis of these visual cues that were going on. I clearly wasn't. It was so fast. It was so rapid. I clearly wasn't actually representing anything about her internal state. I was just getting this huge emotional aversive response. And that was what really led on to the violence inhibition mechanism model that Josh alluded to again earlier on this morning. And the idea of this basic model, this very primitive model, was we had this sort of violence inhibition mechanism, this basic learning system, in other words, that allowed us that when we saw representations of distress cues in the context of representations of transgression, so in this case, me seeing this massive aversive response, having this massive aversive response to the distress cues of the victim, and representing this interpersonal harm situation that was being going on, meant that these two things were being paired together. So if anybody started talking to me about anything like what had happened to this woman in the movie, I would be finding it profoundly disturbing, and basically I'd be getting all these sort of aversive responses, increasing attention, and indeed with the right appraisal, this sort of if I did it, guilt reaction; if somebody else did it, some sort of other emotional state. So that was the sort of VIM model from some time back. And so that's this personalized story, just to show why, I thought, again, in a population of many philosophers out here, I thought this general intuition, personalized intuition viewpoint might be more sympathetically received than in some of my cognitive neuroscience colleagues who want me to shut up about that stuff as fast as possible. So, and maybe you wanted me to shut up about it, but anyway, I was indulging myself at this particular moment, just to give you some sort of context from my end of things. So, developing for the prerequisite for the morality and psychopathy and CU traits. So this basic idea is that we have an emotional learning system that's critical for allowing us to learn about the basics of morality. And I'm really talking about the basics here. And now there's some very nice data, not just by me, but quite a few other groups, showing that individuals with psychopathy show reduced responses to the distress of other individuals. That was the core prerequisite of this model. So in the model previously, if this system doesn't get activated effectively by distress cues, then this system will never start learning. And what you see very clearly is individuals with psychopathy show reduced responses, reduced autonomic responses, reduced sweat responses to the distress of others. They also show problems in recognition of particularly fearful expressions, of other individuals' fearful expressions. Not every single study does, but the fact is that if you do a meta-analysis, you get these very relatively strong effect sizes showing that indeed most studies do find that the expression that individuals with psychopathy have such difficulty recognizing is the fearful expression of other individuals. Very selective. It's not there's a generalized problem in processing expressions. It's a very specific problem to fear and to a lesser extent to sad expressions. And indeed, obviously, they are the strong thing. If they're having this problem with responding to distress cues, then they shouldn't learn the badness so effectively of transgressions that are based around distress cues. They shouldn't learn the badness of care-based moral transgressions as effectively. And that's indeed exactly what we find, is that basically if you remove the rule in individuals with psychopathy, you find that they're more likely to allow moral transgressions, and they make just generally less of a distinction between moral and conventional transgressions in the absence of a rule than in the presence of a rule. This is child data here. Children are much more likely to allow the moral transgressions in the absence of the rules. Adults won't actually allow anything, so you get the result much up the top. Now, admittedly, obviously Mark was getting a very different result. All I can say is there's been a bunch of studies on this. And in fact, rather embarrassingly, when I first documented this in '95, thinking that, woohoo, I was the first one to see this, a few years later I realized that in fact I wasn't the first one to see this, and 12 years before, Larry Nucci and a colleague had documented this for the very first time. And fortunately for my career progression, they never really talked about this as so significant for understanding moral development. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here today. I'd probably be working in Burger King. So it was a very, very handy thing that one wasn't taken forward at that point. But it's been documented by quite a few groups, although clearly, Mark and I need to work out why on earth he's not getting it and we and others have. In a nice way, not with beer glasses. So, now the really nice thing about psychopathy, and the really nice thing as regards from a theoretical perspective about psychopathy, is that it's such a selective disorder, at least if the groups are diagnosed well, that you don't see, there's many psychiatric conditions that you can work with that have many, many types of problems, and so it's very difficult to make these sort of clean, relatively clean cuts. Great thing about psychopathy, at least for most cases with psychopathy, is that indeed it's a relatively precise disorder, not a generalized disorder at all in impairment. In fact, you don't see, for example, executive dysfunction, classic executive dysfunction, Stroop tasks, working memory tasks, all of that sort of stuff, classic executive function impaired in many psychiatric populations, no significant impairment in this population. Another nice thing is you don't see theory of mind impairments in this population either. At least most groups haven't found theory of mind impairments in this population. So again, you've got a nice selectivity with respect to the social domain. And then just for Mark, we don't see inhibitory problems either. So you do motor go-no-go type tasks, stop type tasks, you do Stroop type tasks. You never see impairments with respect to those sort of generalized inhibitory type tasks. Or again, most groups don't find that. Now, what I really want to again make this point, and why I brought up that population with low levels of CU traits, the more emotionally reactive groups, none of these things, or perhaps the no theory of mind impairment, but certainly these two things don't hold. That population have very striking executive dysfunction, and they also have very clear, or at least, problems in inhibition as well. So this is in some respects, you've actually got quite a nice, if these things were critical, certainly these two things were critical for moral development, we'd be seeing problems in this population with low CU traits, but not necessarily perhaps in the population with high CU traits. So, if we agree that there's a core aspects with respect to the processing of fearful expressions and responding, that type of empathic response to the distress and fear of another individual, and that's a prerequisite for the development of these very basic aspects of morality, then what can we tell about that with respect to the neurobiology of these very basic aspects what can we learn about the very basic aspects of morality on the basis of what we can learn about the neurobiology of psychopathy? And so I'm going to be, but this very nicely echoes really what Josh's paper this morning. Again, focusing on the amygdala, focusing on orbitofrontal cortex, the region just above the eye, and the amygdala a bit behind. Great thing about these two regions is there's a fantastic amount of literature on what these regions do. I mean, animal data, human imaging data. So we've got a really relatively precise, certainly with respect to the amygdala, it becomes a bit more complicated with respect to OSC, but certainly with respect to the amygdala, we've got really a whole body of data showing that the amygdala is absolutely critical for stimulus reinforcement learning the goodness and badness of objects and representations. And then it has this reciprocal relationship with orbitofrontal cortex and some other regions as well with the orbitofrontal cortex. And it appears that what orbitofrontal cortex is doing in this case is allowing you to represent the value of the thing that you're processing at the moment in order for you to be able to make decisions about it. So it's allowing you to represent the value. And really, this is data that I take most of my view on what's really going on at a more precise nature, purely out of the animal literature. I mean, it's the work really of Jeff Schoenbaum and colleagues and Michele Gallica, which has been very, very nice in specifying the way that the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex talk to each other, the computational processes involved, in order to get basic types of decision-making paradigms going. And in fact, the paradigm they use is functionally identical to a paradigm we use with adults with psychopathy. And I'm going to tell you a bit about that paradigm in a little while. But the animal equivalent, it's called a go-no-go task in this context, where basically, if there's a good cue, if there's a good smell cue in the environment, then if the rat approaches the food tray, it will get reward. If there's a bad odor cue in the environment, then if the rat approaches the food tray, it will get punished. It won't be able to get food reward for a time afterwards. So in other words, we've got a very simple approach avoidance decision-making task for the rat, and we have a very simple approach avoidance decision-making task for the human that I will be describing to you a little while later. And the great thing about this literature is that they very clearly documented not just the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex are involved, but the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex are involved in a highly integrative fashion. I mean, it came up a little bit in the question times before, is how these systems talk back to each other, and they're massively, massively talking back to each other. And we see it so nicely indeed, because if we lesion the amygdala, we see problems in the ability of OFC to code information with respect to the cue. It doesn't really start responding to the cue in the way that it should do in order to make a good decision. Similarly, if we lesion orbitofrontal cortex, we see reduced ability of the amygdala to code both the cue and in that expectancy phase before when it's waiting for reinforcement. One of the reasons why I just want to reiterate this point is there's a lot of viewpoint that the OFC is the brakes on the amygdala. In the clinical neuroscience literature, it's very often said the OFC is the brakes on the amygdala. It has an inhibitory role on the amygdala. But that's just not right, certainly not in the context of decision-making paradigms. Because what we see very clearly here is we lesion the OFC, We don't see a disinhibition of the amygdala where it's suddenly going really, really responsive to cues, really, really responsive in the expectancy phase. No, we're seeing a reduced responsiveness of these neurons. So we get a very clear view on the fact that these systems are massively interconnected and massively interactive in the context of these very basic decision-making type ideas. So, one of the clearest ways we can look at stimulus reinforcement learning is to look at aversive conditioning. And this was done by the German group, and I'm very clear to stress the German group. On one occasion, I managed to refer to this group as a Dutch group, and the German publicly chastised me for doing this. So I'm very clear that this is a German group so that you'll know, and I never made a mistake ever again. So, but it's a really, it's a gorgeous study, very nice study. One of the very earliest things that was documented with individual psychopathy, problems in aversive conditioning. The blue triangle associated with the electric shock, so you get a sweat response when you see the blue triangle versus the green triangle not. That sort of classic basic emotional learning. Critically involved, the amygdala is critically involved in doing that basic emotional learning. In healthy individuals, individuals with psychopathy have been long documented to show profound problems in aversive conditioning behaviorally. And in fact, what you see is reduced amygdala responses and reduced RFC responses when they're actually engaged in that conditioning process. So very nicely compatible with the position. With respect to expressions, now there's been, the amygdala and fearful expressions in particular, but sad expressions as well. The amygdala and fearful expressions has long been linked together. So there's been quite a long documentation showing amygdala responses when you see fearful expressions. One of that sort of given rise to this idea that in fact, because it's fear rather than angry faces, it's because one is ambiguous and one is not. So angry faces, I show an anger response to you, or you show an anger response to me. It's unambiguous. I know that you're threatening me. I know there's something dangerous in the environment. Whereas if I show a fearful response, you don't know what the hell I'm frightened about, but you just know something out there is dangerous. And so that was the idea that Whalen was pushing, was the amygdala was responding to ambiguous stimuli. Anger faces aren't ambiguous, fear faces are, and that's why we get a stronger amygdala response to fear faces. Well, I would obviously argue, though, given the animal literature, that it's all about stimulus reinforcement learning, and that basically that some stimuli initiate stimulus reinforcement learning more reliably than others. And in fact, anger has a very different social purpose than fear. We're basically normally telling people when we're angry with them that they should stop doing what they're doing right now and not do it anymore. We're getting them to reverse their behavior, stop doing that particular action. And in fact, angry faces are associated with activity in those regions that are also associated with with changing behavior. They're not so associated with amygdala responses. So these two contrasting positions. Very nice study by the Berkeley group. Catherine Hooker was the main author. She was not formally testing between these positions, but the data was very nice. So she had these sort of fearful faces, either looking towards an object or not looking towards an object. Clearly, this is an unambiguous situation. We know exactly why this woman is frightened. She's frightened by this object. We don't know what this woman is frightened by. So if Whalen was correct, we should see increased activity of the amygdala here. If the sort of stimulus reinforcement learning view is correct, we should see increased activity here. And of course, that's what we see. Very striking increased activity when the amygdala has both a stimulus to learn about, this novel little object, as well as the reinforcement value of the face. So very rapid learning about the value of items on the basis of other people's facial cues with respect at least for fearful and to a lesser extent sad expressions. So obviously if this sort of story as regards psychopathy is correct, then we should see profound problems in individuals with psychopathy in responding to the distress of other individuals, particularly with respect to fearful expressions. And so this was what this study was examining. We were looking at the response of fearful relative to neutral expressions. We also looked at anger responses relative to neutral, and these were obviously morphed stimuli in the paradigm. And what you see basically is whereas healthy children and children with ADHD show an increased response to the fearful face relative to the neutral face, this was not significantly different in the cases of the individuals with callous unemotional traits. No difference in response to the neutral expression, but whereas the healthy individuals and the children with ADHD increased their response when the face was showing fear, the children with callous unemotional traits just did not. And this is nicely replicated now by Essie Viding in a sample before, and in a subclinical sample actually was showed a couple of years ago as well. So it seems to be a relatively robust result. What we also look at, so the one core aspect of this whole model is the amygdala is critical for learning about the value of objects, but it also has a role in passing that information forward to orbitofrontal cortex so effective decision-making can take place. You need to be able to represent this information, this value information in orbitofrontal cortex in order to make good decisions about that information. And so what we can look at is using functional connectivity. We can see which of the brain, which regions in the brain, or which voxels in the brain are showing a correlated activity. So when the amygdala gets more responsive, what other regions also get more responsive? When the amygdala gets less responsive, what other regions also get less responsive? And what you see is a very nice positive connectivity between the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex that's significantly less in the children with callous unemotional traits. They're making significantly less connectivity, or significantly less functional connectivity between the amygdala and OFC. One of the things we've just found, I don't have a slide for it, but I'm just briefly going to mention, one of the issues, possible issues, and in fact what we'd assume we might find, was that there might be reduced structural connectivity. So we're actually examining the white matter fiber tracts between the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex to see whether we actually see reduced structural connectivity at the same time as this reduced functional connectivity. There's been a study a year or so back in adults, a small sample of adults actually reporting reduced structural connectivity as well as our reports of reduced functional connectivity. But we don't see this in these children. We don't see evidence of reduced structural connectivity, not in the sample we're seeing. And that's actually relatively optimistic news. It means that we may actually have a little bit more extra time with these U's if we can actually get appropriate treatments in order to actually make sure the system doesn't get even more disrupted, at least if it's right that the data in the adults shows that really this connectivity is not just functional but also structural, that over time, developmentally, the ability of the amygdala to OFC to talk to each other is not just disrupted but actually structurally damaged. Now, this is that task that is identical computationally in many respects to the task that we see in the animals. The go-no-go task in the animals is very similar to this passive avoidance task in the humans. In that task, we don't have good smells and bad smells, but we have good numbers and bad numbers. If you respond when the number 39 is on the screen, you'll get a reward. It's a very simple point reward. You get a reward. If you respond when the number of 47 is on the screen, you'll get a punishment. So you're learning the number 39 is good, I should respond towards it. The number 47 is bad, I should avoid, I should hold back. Just exactly the same paradigm as the rat study by Schoenbaum and others. And in fact, in healthy individuals, you see exactly the same regions as you see in the rat being involved. The amygdala, OFC, and caudate become critically involved in your ability to pass this sort of paradigm. I won't go through the critical details, but it's a very classic finding, originally documented by Joe Newman some time back, basically showing that individuals with psychopathy are significantly poorer at being able to learn to avoid the bad stimuli than the healthy control individual. Very robust result. First documented actually way back 57 by Lycan and systematically documented by Joe Newman. Joe Newman did a lot of work on this paradigm, and indeed we replicate the same behavioral effects. What you see in the imaging data is that particularly for, so this was actually a group by response interaction, you see this marked problem in the individuals with psychopathy in responding particularly for the rewarded stimuli. So that when you were getting when you responded to the good stimuli and got a reward, you should see, as the healthy individuals showed, this very nice increase in activity, or a very nice significant activity, but what you weren't seeing this effective signaling of the good stimuli in the individuals with psychopathy. In addition, if you look at the very early responses, there's this thing called a prediction error. If you're just sitting on your chair right now, and then you see an envelope next door to you, you have no real prediction about what's going to be in that envelope. But say you open the envelope and there's $1,000 in there. You're going to probably have a really nice positive glow about you for a little bit later after that because you've got a prediction error. You were expecting nothing, and you suddenly got this spectacular reward. And so what happens if you have early predictions, the very first times that you have a reinforcement, you get this thing called a prediction error. As what you were expecting does not meet up with what you were guessing, and particularly very early on, you get these very striking expectancy violations effects. In fact, you see this very dramatically with healthy individuals, But you don't see that with the individuals with psychopathy. They're not showing this very early response to early reinforcement cues. And again, the whole point about a prediction error is it makes you learn really rapidly. I can guarantee if I leave an envelope with $1,000 next to your chair, you open it, you find it. If you see another envelope next to somebody else's chair, you're going to go after that envelope because you're going to be thinking, I might get another $1,000. You're going to learn very rapidly about it. The reason, again, why we're so interested in these sort of processes is because that seems, and this where it ties back in with Josh's data, seen these regions being so important for really basic moral judgment tasks as well. And this is a very simple moral implicit association test. I'm not going to go into the details about the paradigm. All the subject really had to do, though, is just respond with one button if they saw a pro-social action and another button if it was an antisocial action. So you're just looking at the regions that were responding when you were processing in this very, very primitive way the good and the bad transgressions and pro-social actions, or at least not transgressions, actions, positive actions. And you see a very clear involvement of the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex showing increased responses to these transgression and also pro-social actions. But you don't see that in children with callous unemotional traits. So this was a very similar study, not exactly the same study, but a very similar study. And whereas, particularly for legal items, we see this very striking difference between the groups. Not so much, actually, it has to be said, and we weren't expecting this at all. We expected to see it for both legal and illegal items. We did not get a significant difference from the illegal items. I have I've got no position as to why that case. I think it's just a statistical unfortunate event. Because obviously we saw with Kent's data that Josh was alluding to, and also with respect to the Glenn data I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes, the amygdala effect's been very profound for these very negative events. But we just weren't seeing it in this particular study. But we got it very crystally clear with respect to the pro-social events. And we also saw all over again, using functional connectivity, reduced functional connectivity in the children with CU traits, CD and CU traits, relative to the healthy children. And again, this is exactly the same study that was mentioned a couple of times this morning. This study by Glenn, again, showing this profound problem in the amygdala response to the the high victim salience transgressions in the individuals who are high on psychopathy. Now, I'm going to skip that study because we don't really have enough time for it, and because I think somebody's sooner or later going to show me an angry face and ask me to stop. So I'm going to just skip that study and just go on for a couple of other implications. So hopefully all I've tried to do here was basically show you that what we're seeing is this basic architecture, the amygdala, orbitofrontal cortex, hopefully get you a flavor of the types of computational processes both of those systems do, and why they would be important for basic moral judgments. The judgment that this is a bad thing or this is a good thing. Because the amygdala has allowed us to make this stimulus reinforcement associated, allowed us to learn that this particular representation of this action or that action is associated with a good response or with a bad response. So the amygdala has allowed us to do that learning, and the amygdala, as part of its function, is passing that information up to OFC in order for us to make an informed decision on the basis of that information. So that's the basic argument that I would push. And what's happened in individuals with psychopathy is disruption both in the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex. So they're poorer at learning about the badness of the action, and they're also poorer at learning about poorer at deciding on the basis of whatever information they have available. So it's not that the amygdala is completely gone, it's not that they have no capacity, but they have a poorer ability to learn and a poorer ability to use that information after whatever learning has taken place. But what other implications are there? Well, one, I sort of alluded to this earlier on, and it came up very nicely with Walter's talk. Very clearly, multiple moralities. We have to conclude there are multiple moralities. First reason why we want to conclude there are multiple moralities, moral conventional distinction, the conventional items, the whole conventional reasoning process that Churio, Smetana, and Nucci were talking about, it's basically identical or very, very similar to what Jonathan Haidt talks about with respect to authority, I can't remember the actual phrase he uses, but authority. These are conventional items are all about the dominant individual making sure that the non-dominant individual does what they're told, and you use anger to make sure that they're manifested. And indeed, there's no reason to believe that individuals with psychopathy have any problems in processing conventional items, and in fact, there's quite a lot of reason to believe they're totally intact. both because of the way you see performance on the conventional distinction, but also more precise measures of conventional reasoning. And in fact, there's a very nice study by Jonathan Haidt that also, I'll talk about that in a second. What I should also mention, again, it came up with Walter's talk, this disgust-based morality, particularly about sexual norms, often used, but it can be used for a whole variety of norms depending on the individual. What's really nice, again, about, and that was a lot of data Jonathan Haidt was working on, was disgust-based morality, and rose in before, but particularly Jonathan Haidt's been very interested in disgust-based morality. Again, what's really nice is that, and what's particularly nice because Jonathan Haidt's documented it, you don't have to any longer refer to the paedophile as being the anecdotal report. There's a very nice study that Jonathan Haidt did, admittedly in a subclinical sample, but still it was a data set showing that whereas there was profound impairment with respect to harm-based reasoning, authority judgments or conventional judgments, as far as I would be concerned, was intact. And also disgust-based norm judgments were intact in the questionnaire survey that they did. So very nice division between this that's disrupted in those individuals with elevated callous unemotional traits and these things which are completely intact, or at least appear to be not significantly disrupted in that population. So again, echoing Walter's point, we must indeed be dividing. There isn't one unitary moral system. I mean, you always a more philosophical debate about how we, and I'm not going to get into that. I'm just purely echoing what you said, that we really need to be precisely defining. And we saw it again with Josh's talk as well. I mean, that whole network that was coming up with respect to honesty had nothing to do with the types of systems, the amygdala and OFC, that both Josh and I document with respect to these sorts of basic harm-based moral judgments. The other thing, the idea is that this sort of function is absolutely critical for moral socialization. In order to learn that some things are bad things to do, we need to have this system to be intact. And there's quite a lot of very nice data now, parenting data, showing that there are ways of socializing your children to behave in a good, guilt-ridden way. I mean, the empathy induction is a particularly good way. If you have two kiddies fighting, one kiddie fights the other kiddie, you say, look at what you've done to the other kiddie, look how sad they are, look how miserable they are, you concentrate their attention on it, and you make them all nicely guilty. So indeed, if you have kiddies, thinking about having kiddies, look after occasionally somebody else's kiddies, empathy induction, a wonderful way to go to make sure you have gorgeously guilt-ridden kiddies. Those types of socialization practices, though, don't work very effectively in individuals with psychopathy. With elevated CU traits, we don't see the advantage. Originally documented by Paul Frick, but several other groups now have documented as well. Very, 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 very clear effect. What they haven't actually done, and these are very nice in the sort of longitudinal studies to do, would be actually show that that actually also relates to moral judgments, but those data haven't been in yet. Finally, and here's actually where, I actually completely agree with Mark. So there we go. We're not rabidly anti each other or any of that stuff. There's no beer glasses at dawn. It's all very wholesome and sociable and lovely even. So here I completely agree. And in fact, actually, this really is the original critique was by Sean Nichols. And it was a devastating critique, as far as I'm concerned, with respect to a pure emotion view on moral judgment. And his argument was that, actually we'll get on to the flat right. His argument was that VIM, that was the days of the VIM model, but this basic emotional learning systems would get you judgments of badness, but they wouldn't get you judgments of immorality. And the reason why they wouldn't get you judgments of immorality is because the system should fire if the distress cue is being done by, say, the roof collapses here and some of you are screaming in pain. I'm going to get a strong emotional reaction. I'm going to regard the thing as a very bad occurrence, but I'm not going to regard it as an immoral occurrence. I'm just going to say that this was a really, really bad thing to have occurred. The thing that marks out morality for harm-based stuff from purely just a bad thing occurring is, well, in Sean's view, was the idea that we could access a rule about it. That because we have a rule about thumping people, we know that thumping people plus distress cues is immoral, but roofs falling in is not. Another perhaps simpler way is just purely, and this sort of echoes a little bit of what Mark was also saying, the importance of theory of mind or representations of intent. If the intent was to harm the other individual, it's almost inevitably going to be referred to as moral, not in every single context, but most often in those contexts. And certainly that type of that additional types of reasoning is absolutely critical for generating immorality judgments or morality judgments, not just badness judgments. And the reason why I thought this was quite fun when I added this in with respect to the flat and round worlders, although I was a bit alarmed, as I get older and fatter, the idea of being referred to as a round worlder I found really disturbing. But anyway, I thought this was actually quite a nice potential distinction, because we had with Mark's result, we had this bit of a debate at the end of Mark's serotonin result, that what was really being driven, was it some access to a rule system, or was it indeed increasing the value representation? If it's increasing the value representation, as I would believe, then if you did the serotonergic manipulation again, the citalopram manipulation again, what you would see would be an increased intensity of the badness for not just actions that involve intentional harm to another individual, but also your judgments of badness about, earthquakes and calamities of an unintentional nature. Whereas if it's a purely effect on rule salience, I am going to shut up in a couple of seconds, honest, I am. If it's a purely based around rule access, then immorality judgments will be manipulated, but more profoundly than just badness judgments. Badness judgments don't rely necessarily on the rule, but you might not like that that way. But anyway, I thought that that was a potential one. The other thing I want to just say, and this I think actually is really my last point, well, sort of, but my last point with respect to theory of mind, because again, Mark made reference to it, it was made reference to it yesterday. There's no doubt about it. I think, again, this is where I think the emotion viewpoint, again, does become less relevant. So I'm a developmentalist. I'm critically important about why these things, why morality ever developed in the first place. I don't so much focus about what's happening on an adult level for all contexts. And what we see very clearly is the impact of intent information changing our moral judgments. And we get this very profound sort of age effect. So that before the age of 8, in a very crude sense, before the age of 8, we're really making badness judgments on the basis of how bad the consequences are, how much the other person got hurt, or how much disruption occurred. But after the age of 8, and again, I'm crudely using that age number, but after about the age of 8, then intention becomes massively more important. So in other words, the person driving down the road, losing control of the car, killing a whole bunch of people, by a 6-year-old might be judged as equivalently bad to somebody who drove down the road and intentionally squished the other people. But obviously, from an adult perspective, you're regarding one as a deeply immoral thing to do, the intentional harm, but you're not regarding, the other one's maybe bad, an unfortunate event, but you're not thinking about it in any way the same way. And in fact, Rebecca Sachs has done a considerable body of data. It was made reference to yesterday in the first talk, showing that. It's a bit alarming, though. Often the outcome information has no impact at all on the reasoning in those paradigms. And it may be because they're all MIT students, but we don't know. But there's something very odd about that. But it may be the paradigm. But the critical thing is we really do see the impact of intent information having such a major role, particularly in adult reasoning, when there's intent information to manipulate. So very finally, psychopathy, elevated CU traits is not the only form of increased risk for antisocial behavior. That was that very first point, so you've got to be very careful. You do indeed need to make the same distinctions that you make with respect to morality, with respect to antisocial populations. An appropriate emotional response to the history of others is critical for the development of care-based morality. Doesn't have any impact on conventional reasoning, doesn't have any impact on disgust-based norms, doesn't have any impact on dishonesty, I think, as well, probably. But absolutely critical for care-based norms. This relies on the amygdala OFC, these core components of the pathophysiology of psychopathy, CU traits. And because of work with psychopathy, we can know that the basis of moral judgments are not dependent on non-emotional executive function, theory of mind, and inhibition, certainly in the context of other patient populations. In addition, the clearly multiple moralities, again echoing what we heard before, and only care-based morality is impaired in psychopathy. And care-based moral reasoning, the full reasoning thing, is not just an emotional response. And that's the end.